Hi, how are you guys? My name is Jayanth, and in this video, I want to discuss a very recent update by Adobe, which they called the 2021 Lightroom update. And to be honest, it's an update on the Camera Raw that they have come up with. And let's discuss without any further ado what the changes to this particular instance of the upgrade is like. I'm on the Adobe site. This is the Adobe site where they speak about the feature summary, which means they call this the October 2020 release, but it's actually been referred to as the 2021 Lightroom update. They have a few things that are interesting here, amongst which the most sought after is something we call the color grading. I'll discuss this in detail, but before that, let's go ahead and delve into Lightroom and see what are some very obvious changes that they have been talking about. So what they usually do every time they upgrade the software is they make it much more sleek, much more usable. They add a lot of decisions in software engineering which help user experience and improve it. They upgrade the ergonomic design of the application. They come up with UI improvements and stuff like that. And amongst the most major is this particular improvement. So if you see, this is my Lightroom. It's a catalog that I'm using called a temp catalog. I'm in an empty collection right now. This catalog has hundreds of photographs, in fact 7,800 photographs, but I don't want to take focus away from what we're talking about. So one of the most interesting upgrades is basically a feature of Lightroom where you can, in the develop module of Lightroom, modify the panels that you have on the right hand side. So let me open up a particular let's demo collection inside Lightroom. So let's say I go to this photograph of mine. If you remember, I put up something similar on the last week's video of this catalog. So this is a photograph of mine. It's a raw file. It's been photographed by my colleague on a Nikon D850. We spoke about that. If I go to the develop module of Lightroom, you will see that there are a lot of interesting things that are happening in the develop module. The most important interesting thing is this particular thing here called customize the develop panel, which means if you click on that, you can actually select what panels you are interested in and what panels you probably will never use. For example, I usually don't use the transform. So let's understand what the transform is. Let's go to transform. Transform is used probably more by architecture photographers who want to correct the pictures with respect to perspective or lines and stuff like that. And in the case of a nature photographer, which is me, I wouldn't probably use that much. So here's a use case. I go to the customize develop panel and I would definitely not want to have the transform on my right hand panel, and I'll save it, and transform vanishes from this view here, and that is how you can get rid of the UI elements or the panels that you don't really need. Of course, I don't really have a recommendation for what you shouldn't have here. I just gave an example because depending on the genre of photography you're into, depending on the style of post-processing you adopt, you could be avoiding some panels, or you would probably need everything at some point or the other. If you want something like, for example, if I'm editing an architecture image, I can right click here, customize, and go back and ask for transform to come back, and I will have right here, so that I don't need to worry about missing out something forever. It's just a temporary update. You're disabling your view with that because you don't want to clutter your right hand side panels with things that you don't need. So that's probably one of the most important updates with respect to the UI of the software. So they've been speaking about making this faster editing with all new performance improvements, which cannot be seen through our naked eye. It's something you feel when you start using the application. So let me not speak too much about it. There are also support for newer cameras. I'm sure there's a long list of new cameras that they support. The world has been rolling out cameras left, right, and center from all the brands in the market. There have been new cameras. So you can actually be using Lightroom and probably have access to editing your raw file, which is probably what we call in software engineering as platform independent, or let's call it, it's agnostic to any particular brand. You can actually buy any camera in the world which shoots raw, and Lightroom is going to probably understand the raw file, if not today, definitely in a few days from now, because new camera models keep coming and it's a continuous process. They've been talking about some updates to the tethering feature of the camera or the Lightroom software. For example, if you are a studio photographer and you're using a Canon camera, for example, you can tether the view of your camera directly into Lightroom, and when you click a picture, it will directly come to Lightroom, which is what is called tethering, and you can actually look at the camera models that Lightroom now supports, especially with respect to Canon cameras, it seems. With respect to Sony, we use an application called Imaging Edge, and we basically coexist with Lightroom and that application. Now, let's see some more features of Lightroom. So let me go back to Lightroom catalog and let's look at my own picture here, which is a raw file. One of the most interesting things that has happened here, if you double click on this, it zooms in, and if you click again, it will zoom out. Now, if you hold the shift arrow key and click the mouse anywhere and drag to the right or left, see what happens. Now, let's say I click here, it changes the cursor to a magnifying glass, and you can zoom in and zoom out by holding the shift key while you're moving your mouse left and right. This is an amazing cool feature that has been added. So that's one new feature. Now, if you hold the control key on a Windows machine, or in my case as a Mac user, a command key, and do exactly the same thing by holding a mouse and drawing a rectangle, it is going to zoom in that rectangle. So I'll hold the shift again now, I'll go back to the entire view. Let's say I want to see how sharp my eyes were. I'm going to press the command and I'm just going to go and draw a rectangle around my face. It's going to zoom in that particular area. And this is a very sharp image of my face. Of a not so sharp guy, a pretty sharp image. So again, reiterating what we are talking about, hold shift, move your mouse, clicking it left and right, and it will change the magnification of your image. Hold control or command on a Mac and draw a rectangle, it will zoom in that area and make it fit to your screen. So hold a shift arrow key again and get back. This is one interesting feature update that Lightroom has rolled out on the 2021 update of Lightroom. So also there's been some additions here, especially in the fit. They have fit and fill, and of course they have different percentages that you can choose that you can fit into your Lightroom's view that might help you edit better. So let's say 100% view, or let's say fit, it will fit the whole screen, and that is what is an update. So going ahead and seeing some more updates, they are talking about internal software and catalog updates. Now, for example, every time, I'll take you to my desktop, every time you migrated from one version of Lightroom to another. Now look at this folder of mine, it's a live folder. It's a catalog folder of a shoot that I did in 2015. This is called the Costa Rica 2015 catalog. And if you see, there are 3 LR catalog files here. So there are 3 LR catalog files here. One was the first one that I made when I was in Costa Rica, when I downloaded images, imported them through Lightroom. That is what I called as Costa Rica 2015.lrcad. Somewhere a couple of years later, Lightroom came up with a newer way of understanding catalogs. They changed the architecture, and the moment I opened this catalog in the newer version of Lightroom, it automatically forced me to upgrade my catalog, and it renamed the catalog from Costa Rica 2015 to Costa Rica 2015 and added the -2 to it, which meant that this was the first catalog, which was the updated version of the catalog. And today there is an even more bigger update, and they have a newer version of the software, and they add another -2 to your catalog. Now it seems when you're creating a new catalog by importing it into Lightroom or opening it into Lightroom, it no longer is this automatic -2 appending that happens on the catalog's name. In fact, it allows you to choose a name for it. For example, you can rename this as Lightroom catalog, Lightroom Classic 10, or let's say you can put the date of the catalog just for you to remember when did you actually work on this catalog and stuff like that. So now, instead of being a not so control oriented renaming of the catalog just because you upgraded it, now they allow you to name the upgrade version of the catalog. But guys, the most important thing that we would like to see in this particular video is this. So if you go to this photograph and you open it in the develop module, you'll see there is an amazing panel that existed in the previous versions of Lightroom that no longer exists. And that is what we call as split toning. If you're used to Lightroom, or if you've taken my course in Lightroom, and if you have learned how to use many aspects of Lightroom, especially in the develop module, you know that there was this amazing panel here called split toning, which is probably one of the least understood panels of Lightroom or develop module aspects of Lightroom, in my opinion. I think they have adopted this approach of renaming this particular thing as color grading, because in the world of video, this is a very common terminology used. Adobe Premiere Pro, or let's say Final Cut Pro, and everybody who does video editing uses this term. They say things like, hey, I have finished my edit, but I have to color grade my videos. So what they mean by color grading is something we'll just explore right now, not from the video context, but from the still photography raw file context. So color grading is a panel which is nothing but the old module that we had, which was called split toning. So let's revise a little bit about what split toning was. In a photograph, there are the shadows and then there are the highlights. So when you did split toning usage of modifying an image, you could have chosen that I would like my shadows to have this tint of color, and I could want my highlights to have this tint of color, and you could make all the shadows blue, for instance, and all the highlights yellow, for instance, and modify it. It was exceptionally useful for people who work on sepia rendering or monochromes and stuff like that, where they want to add a little bit of tint to their image. Making a monochrome and then moving it to a sepia was exactly this, using a red or a crimson tinge on your shadows to make it a sepia kind of a thing. So now they modified this in the 2021 update, and now they're calling it color grading. And what is color grading? It's exactly the same. It works on the shadows of your raw file, it works on the highlights of your raw file, and what's new, it also works on the mid tones of your raw file. So let's just quickly snap here to my screen, and you might notice the histogram of this photograph. If you see, the left one is the shadows and blacks. The first column here is called the blacks. This is the shadows. This is the exposure, which is nothing but the mid tones. This is of course the highlights column, and of course the last one is the whites. So whites, then highlights, then midtones, then blacks, shadows and blacks. So these are the 5 columns of the exposure, the histogram, that you can look at when you're editing an image. Now let us see this image and understand it from the color grading perspective. Now I would probably be not looking at this particular UI exactly. I'll come back to this later on. If you notice, right now there are 3 wheels here, and each of these wheels represent the shadows, highlights and midtones. If you want to go to the 3 wheels, you can watch them here by having all the 3 here. This is the midtones, this is the shadows, and this is the highlights. You could be working in this perspective here, which is just a different UI for the same thing. Or you could simply click on this one, which says it's the shadows. This is one of the 3 here. It's been brought out and laid out like this. This is the shadows wheel. Click on this, it is the highlights or the midtones view. And if you click on this one, this is the highlights view. You could also be clicking on the left semicircle here, which will take you from highlights to midtones. Click left semicircle again, it will move from midtones to shadows. And now there is no more left semicircle here. Now it's all about the right side, because after the shadows there's nothing more to the left of it. Now on the shadows, click on this, it will go to midtones again. Click on this particular thing, it will go to highlights again. So if you want, you can enable all the 3 in one view, which is what is called as midtone, shadows and highlights, in these 3 different tonal ranges that you can color correct and work on, which is, in other words, color grade your pictures. Now let's pick up one at a time and see what happens. Now, what are shadows? Let's come back to this image. I want you to focus on another image. I'm going to take you away into a particular collection that I've just created, and this is a collection I've created called 2021 Update, because I wanted these 2 raw files to be there, or this picture to be there, so that we discuss this. For some of you who have attended my black and white photography webinar, and online classes, you would have seen that I have discussed about the tonal range of an image. How are the tonal ranges of an image? Like there are different zones. There are 10 zones according to the Ansel-Adams zonal system, and how zone 0 is pure black and zone 10 is pure white, and there are multiple tonal ranges in between which are called zone 1 to zone 9, which is what is called the dynamic range of an image. Ansel-Adams just split them into 10 different zones for us to understand it easily. So if you remember this slide, especially people who have attended my black and white class, if you have not, please go to the Toehold Academy. I'll also put a story right now for the black and white webinar recording that you can watch. It's just $4.99. We're running a discount of 20%. You can use a coupon code 100K and access it. Anyway, coming back to this here, let me go back to Lightroom. I have imported this particular image here into Lightroom so that we understand how this works, so that we explore how to take this to the develop module now. But let me come back to this photograph on the develop module. Actually, it's not a photo, it's just a gray card with multiple shades of gray, which is representing the tonal range of an image. Now guys, I want you to see how the shadows, midtones and highlights work on this particular tonal range. So let's go to the shadows part here. Let's say I would love the shadows of my photograph to be blues. Why? There's no such logic. It's just what I want. So I'll select a blue on my shadows, and the moment I select blues, I can enable the exact tone of blue. I'm just going to go a little to the right here to get a darker blue, and let's say this is the blue I want, and you can already see that taking effect on my zonal system here. If you see number 3, number 2 and number 4 are getting a tint of blue. That is because they belong to the shadows part of my histogram. They belong to the shadows part of my tonal range. Now I can actually vary the intensity of the luminance. I can make it brighter or darker of the shadows here, or just double click on luminance and leave it as is. I've just selected a particular tone here. Just for the sake of understanding, let me go ahead and select a pink here, and you'll see how the tonal range has changed here. I don't like pink for my shadows. I'll come back to blues and leave it like this. Now let's go ahead and select the mid-tones here. Mid-tones, and let's see what happens to the mid-tones. Now just for the sake of learning, let's say I want my mid-tones to be green. So I'll select green here, and I'll start moving my slider to select the exact green here. And let's say this is the green I want, and it's only colored, or it's graded my mid-tone section of my histogram or my tonal range of an image. Likewise, I'd love to go to my highlights, which is this one, and in the highlights, let's say I want a color which is close to red or crimson. So I'll select the color red here, and I'll start modifying the exact color I want on the color wheel, and let's say I selected this rich red here. Now if you come to the tonal range here, you can see the mid-tones have tints of green, the shadows have tints of blue, and the highlights have a tint of red here. You might be wondering, okay, I understand the science of it, but how do you actually make an image using these things? So that is a little tricky thing here. It's very easy to understand the science. What's important is to understand the art of it. Now, one thing to notice here is, if you go back to something called as balance, there's a balance slider here, which works on the entire color spectrum here. You can balance this to be a median, or you can say I want this to move, the highlights to move a little towards the shadows, or I want this to move a little towards the highlights. If you remember, we have selected red as the highlight, so the entire tonal range is getting an effect of red, because we have said I want the balance to be closer towards the highlights color. If I move it towards the left, the whole tonal range will start taking effect of the shadows color, which was blue, if you remember. If I leave it in the middle, then it will leave the shadows unaffected, it will leave the highlights unaffected, and it will only work in the tonal range that I am working on. So this is the shadows, highlights, and the mid-tones. Let me go out of this picture, and I'd like to work on this picture, which I've already processed. In other words, I've normalized this picture. Now I'll take this to the develop module. How do you go to develop module? By pressing the letter D. You're in the develop module, and here I'm going to go back to the shadows, and let's see if I make the shadows blue again, what will happen. So I'm going to select a tinge of blue here, tint of blue here or tinge of blue here, and I'm just going to select the blue that I want and see what happens. All the areas which are considered to be shadows, which fall in the tonal range of the zone system of, let's say, 2 or 3, which are shadows area, starts getting this color influence, which is what is called color grading. Now let's say I move to midtones. In midtones, I want the midtones to be, let's say, brownish. So I'll select something here and I can start applying this color change to the midtones of an image. And likewise, I can go to the highlights and I can work on highlights and say, I want the highlights to be, let's say, a cyan or a tinge of that, and I can select the exact color I want on my image and work on that. So guys, in short, it's nothing different. It's the split toning, which has got a different UI. It has 3 different color wheels for the shadows, highlights, midtones, and if you want to, you can go to this one, which is global. After working on shadows, midtones and highlights, you can apply a global filter of colors to your image. Let's say I want to make it a little greenish. I can select the green I want and apply green on the entirety of the image, not just on the shadows or a highlights or a midtone area, and create a different looking image. The trick of this is, the more the options you have, the more you can mess around and make mistakes. But since this is not a tutorial on color grading, I'm just showing you the mechanics of this tool, and maybe someday I can show you exactly how color grading works. But this is one of the most important update in the 2021 Lightroom and the Camera Raw. If you have Photoshop, if you're using Adobe Camera Raw inside of Photoshop, you still have the same power because this is a raw files capability which has been modified by adding this feature to the Adobe Camera Raw. I hope that helps. Any questions on Lightroom, please get in touch with me. If you have still not taken my Lightroom course, which is 10 hours of content, I do not know how else to tell you that it's probably one of the best courses in Lightroom, at least in the Indian context. And I'm running a discount coupon of 20% on my course, which is a discount coupon using the 4-letter word 100K, because I reached 100K a few days ago. I'm still running that discounted offer. Go ahead and add this course to your bucket, add the coupon code, get the 20% discount, and enjoy learning Lightroom, which I really love to use. Any questions? Please feel free to ask. Take care, guys.